Okay, this is the beginning of lesson 6, and the topic is adding 2 or more integers. Now, in the previous lessons, we've taken a look at adding integers already, but we used a number line to show that. And so, for example, if we had a negative 10 plus 6, remember how we did that? And you don't need to write this down in your notes here, I just want you to watch this. So we started at 0, and since it's a negative 10, negative meaning moving left, then we drew a line up and then we moved 10 units to the left. So that move would be a negative 10. Then we drew a line up. Now 6, since there's not a sign here, we know it's positive. So positive meaning going back to the right 6 units. So let's see, I'd go from negative 10, I'd go to the negative 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'd end up at a negative 4, right above the negative 4. That's a move of a positive 6. So a negative 10 plus 6 is a negative 4. And that's how we introduce this to start with. The problem with this, though, is if you have really large numbers. So how about if you had a negative 120 plus 42 or something like this? You probably wouldn't want to draw a number line to do that. So we need a little easier method to fall back on. Now to start with, I want you to, first of all, label your notebooks. And this is lesson 6. Make sure you put lesson 6. And you write down the topic, adding 2 or more integers. Now the first thing I want you to write down in that part of your notebook is rule number 1. So there's 2 rules for adding integers because there's 2 types of situations that we have. And this is going to look like a bunch of gibberish right here, but I like to write this rule this way because it's just shorter. And all this rule number 1 is saying is that a negative integer plus a negative is always negative. So a negative plus a negative is equal to a negative answer. Now, to show you some examples of this, so make sure you pause this if you don't have that written down yet. Let's take a look at example 1, and I want this in your notes. So example number 1. Well, the rule number 1 said a negative plus a negative, which I have here, right? I have a negative plus a negative is always negative. And then you just simply add the integers together. So 7 and 5 is 12. So a negative 5 plus a negative 7 is a negative 12. So I'm just reinforcing the rule by saying it quite a few times. A negative plus a negative is negative. Now, I like to have a little backup plan just to maybe, in case I forget that a negative plus a negative is always negative. Remember, you can always use your number line. Now, sometimes I like to think of it this way. I like to think of problems like this in terms of temperature. If you have a negative 5 degrees, that means a negative 5 below 0, right? So if the temperature drops 5 degrees, which would be at a negative 5, then it drops 7 more. Well, the temperature now is 12 degrees below 0. So the temperature will drop 5 degrees. So we were at 0, it dropped 5, so that we're now at a negative 5. Then it drops 7 more. That's a negative 12. Now you can think of a lot of examples that way. How about it in terms of money? Say in your locker, and sometimes we don't like to use examples like this, but just for the sake of math, we will. Say you have some money in your locker. Somebody took $5. That's a negative action, so that's a negative 5. So somebody took $5 and then took 7 more dollars. Well, they've taken $12, negative 12. Think of adding integers in terms of real life examples like that. Another one involving money. You lend $5 to somebody, and then you lend 7 more to them. You've lent $12 to them, right? Now let's take a look at the next one here. You've got a negative 10 plus a negative 4. Well, from rule number 1, we know a negative plus a negative is always negative, and then add the integers. So the answer to this, or the sum, is a negative 14. Now, in case I'm not sure of this, let's use a real-life example. Say the temperature drops 10 degrees, and then drops 4 more. So it's dropped 14 degrees. Or say somebody takes $10, takes 4 more dollars, they've taken $14, a negative 14. Again, just try to relate this to real life examples. And negative integers relate to maybe a negative action in real life. How about if I'm standing in a certain spot and I take 10 steps backwards, backwards meaning negative, if it was forwards, it would be a positive action. So I take 10 steps backwards, and then I take 4 more steps backwards from that same spot. So I took 10 steps backwards, and then from there I step back 4 more steps. Well, I've stepped back 14 spots from the original position, so a negative 14. So again, a negative plus a negative is always negative. Now let's take a look at the rule number 2 and the final rule. Now here, if you have a negative plus a positive, and I could even write it like this, or a positive plus a negative, it doesn't matter. The order we add doesn't make a difference. So if I'm adding one of each sign, so I'm adding a negative and a positive, unlike here. Here I was adding 2 negatives. Now I'm adding one of each. I'm adding a negative and a positive, or in other words, a positive negative. It means the same thing. How do we handle that now? Well, what we do, and it sounds a little complicated, but you take the difference of the 2 numbers, and it carries the sign of the larger. So write that down, and we're going to go through some examples of that. Example 2. Now, notice that I have, in this first one, a negative 4 plus 8. Or in other words, I could even add a little positive sign there, right? Because when there's not a sign there, we know it's a positive number. So is this rule number 1 or is this rule number 2? It's rule number 2 because you have a negative and a positive here, right? I'm adding a negative number and a positive. Now by the rule, here's how we do this. You take the difference of just the numbers. Ignore the signs. Ignore the signs. Just take the difference of 8 and 4. That's 4, right? Now, 8 is larger than 4. So in other words, my answer is going to carry the sign of the larger number. 8's larger than 4. 8 is positive. It's a positive 4. Or in other words, just 4. Now, let's check this to make sure that I did it right. Temperature drops 4 degrees. So it's 4 degrees below 0, right? But then it goes up 8 degrees. Let's see, if I'm at a negative 4 and I go up to 0 degrees, that's 4. And then go 4 more to get to my 8. So if I'm at a negative 4 degrees below 0 and the temperature rises 8 degrees, does it make sense that I'm at 4 degrees above 0? Positive. Am I at a positive degree, 4 degrees above 0? And the answer is yes. So it makes sense. Here's another one. Somebody takes $4 on my locker, and then maybe they feel guilty because they took it, so then they returned $8. Well, I'm $4 ahead of where I was before. How about our step example? I step back 4 steps, then I move forward 8 steps. I'm 4 steps in front of where I originally was. All right, let's try this next one. I've got a positive 7 plus a negative 12. So I'm adding one of each of the signs. So how do you do this? You take the difference between the numbers. So ignore the signs. Just simply take the difference between 12 and 7. That's 5. And it carries the sign of the bigger. Let's see, 12, ignore the sign. I'm just looking at the numbers themselves. 12 is larger than 7. 12 is negative. So my answer carries the sign of the larger number. So it's a negative 5. Now if I'm unsure of this, let's try a real life example. Let's see, 7, positive. So the temperature goes up 7 degrees. So I was at 0, it goes up 7. I'm at 7 degrees above 0. Then it drops 12. Well, certainly I'm going to be below 0. So if I'm at 7 degrees above 0, well, 7 degrees to 0 is 7, add 5 more, I would be 12. That would be a drop at 12 degrees. I would be at a negative 5 then, below 0. So I was at 7 degrees, and I'm going to drop 12 degrees. So 7 to 0 is 7, drop 5 more, I'm at a negative 5 degrees below 0. So it makes sense. All right, what I want you to do is in the final example, just copy these down, and I want you to pause it, and I want you to try them, and see what you get for the sum. And then we'll go through them. Right, the first one that we have is a negative plus a negative, rule number 1. And a negative plus a negative is negative. And you add the integers together. Let's check it. Temperature drops 4 degrees, then drops another degrees. It's dropped 5 degrees. Makes sense. Okay, the second example. A negative plus a positive. Well, to do this, you take the difference between just the numbers, ignore the signs. The difference between 5 and 2 is 3. And it carries the sign of the bigger. Let's see, 5 is larger than 2, 5 is negative, my answer is negative. Let's check it to see if I did it right. Somebody took $5 out of my locker. So they took $5 away, but they returned 2. Well, I'm still missing $3. Negative, missing being a negative action. Or I take 5 steps backwards, 2 steps forward. I'm still 3 steps behind where I originally was. Okay, the third example, a negative plus a negative is negative, and then add the integers, negative 5. So the temperature drops 2 degrees, drops 3 more, it's dropped to negative 5. It's dropped 5, I should say. Final example, positive plus a negative is rule number 2. Take the difference between 9 and 2 is 7. 9 is the bigger number, it's positive, it's a positive 7. Let's check it to see if it makes sense. Temperature rises 9 degrees, all right, so I'm 9 degrees above 0, then drops 2, so I'm at 7 degrees above 0. Makes sense. All right, so the topic was adding 2 or more integers.